So next up is Andrew. So Andrew, you're at Columbia, is that right?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, so you are going to be telling us about philosophy and representations, which I'm really pleased to hear about. All right, so go ahead, share away.
Yeah. Okay, so is the screen actually sharing?
Yes, it certainly is. We can see it.
Okay, good. Yeah, sorry for all the technical difficulties earlier. Right, so hi. I'm actually, I should mention from the start, I'm a bit of an outsider here. My background and my training is in philosophy, and I have some experience, though a lot less, with neuroscience. So this is all going to be from that angle, and it's probably going to look fairly different than a lot of the other talks. But what I'm interested in is something that philosophy and neuroscience share, which is a really deep interest in representation. So I'm just going to quote here from a preprint from the Cording Lab. They say typical systems neuroscience experiments correlate the activity of recorded neurons with controlled variations in stimuli or behavior. Such experiments are commonly taken to reveal that neural activity is a representation of the stimulus or behavior. But what does this statement mean? Right, so we say all kinds of things. The hippocampus represents spatial locations, the FFA represents faces, retinal ganglion cells represent light values and movement direction, and so on. What does this mean? Why is it important? And is representation essential to neuroscience? There are a lot more concrete, sort of on the ground questions you'll come across. In neuroscience, you ask tons of questions about which neural activity represents, what it represents. Does the FFA represent faces or just objects in your expert domain of discrimination, for example? What computations are performed on the representations? How are the representations implemented? How do we discover any of this experimentally? Philosophers have take a sort of 30,000 foot approach to this. So they're interested in very similar questions. Here's a quote from a very early book by Bob Cummins. He says, "The notion of neural representation is a kind of explanatory loan. If it turns out that the notion of mental and neural representation cannot be given a satisfactory explication, if in particular no account of the nature of the representation relation can be given that is consistent with the empirical theory that assumes it, then, at least in this respect, that empirical theory must be regarded as ill-founded." So I think just given the success of much neuroscience that uses the notion of representation, we don't have to worry too much about it being ill-founded. But we do have to wonder what exactly the representation relation is. There's a bit of a mystery there. So philosophers have traditionally asked just one question: what is neural representation? And they have given a huge variety of answers. The representation defined in terms just of correlation, or in terms of complex causal relationships, or in terms of information carrying or information decoding, or even in terms of evolutionary selection and design. But the answers are all supposed to shed light on these questions, right? If we know what neural representation is, then we'll know which neural activity represents. It's just which neural activity satisfies the definition of representation. And we'll know what it represents because we'll know which environmental entities it satisfies that definition with respect to. So the problem is that despite there being a huge proliferation of answers to this question, there's been very little progress. There's been very little interaction between philosophy and neuroscience on the question, and philosophers have said very few things that neuroscientists have felt compelled to take seriously. And I don't think that's on the neuroscientists. I think it's on the philosophers because I think they're asking the wrong question. And so you do see the similar questions in neuroscience as well. The paper I cited at the beginning, and in some similar work, neuroscience is very interested in defining representation. But I want to change gears and talk instead about what the notion of representation does for neuroscience. So leave aside what representation is, what that relation is, and just think about neuroscience as a science and what using the notion of representation does for neuroscience. And what I want to say is that it provides an intuitive way to project the structure of one domain onto another as a model. So I'll explain what I mean by that. Start with a sort of simple example. Just take some straightforward computer gates, or actually think of a simple circuit composed of gates like this that does something like addition. We're going to think of it in representation terms. We're certainly going to say things like the output of the circuit represents the sum of the inputs to the circuit, since it's doing addition. So again, the question isn't what is it for the output to represent something, but what does it do for us to describe it this way? And one thing you're doing is saying that the relationship between input and output is accurately modeled by the addition function, right? And I think this is generally what representational notions do. They point us to a domain of models rather than to a property that the brain has that relates it to the environment in some way. So when we say that the output of the circuit represents the sum of the inputs, we're saying that the addition function is a good model of the relationship between the input and output. And then we can begin to describe the system literally in terms of the models. So we'll say if you input, give it 5 and 7 as inputs, it'll output 12 or something like that, right? We're not describing the system in terms of its own properties, its physical or electrical properties or mechanical properties. We're describing it in terms of, literally in terms of the model that we're thinking of it as representing. So of course, you don't do this just for the input-output structure. You also do it for the internal causal structure. And so you think of an algorithm that computes or implements the addition function. And some such algorithm is going to be your model of the internal structure of the circuit. And you'll do the same thing as you did with the inputs and outputs. You'll start describing the internal structure in terms of that model. You'll start saying, this is the...
Andrew, I hate to cut in here, but I think something is brushing a mic on your end because we're getting a lot of mic sound.
Oh, sorry. Yeah. Is it still going?
No, now it's good.
Okay, good. Yeah, I think that was me. Right, sorry. So we're going to describe the internal structure of the system in terms of the algorithm or whatever that we're modeling it with. And this has obvious benefits, right? It has all the benefits of a description of a computer in mathematical rather than electrical terms. But the notion of representation specifically is helping us identify possible models, right? That the algorithms that compute the function that we've described the system in terms of. It gives us a way of linking the internal structure of the system to the model by connecting certain parts of the components, certain parts of the system to the components of the model that we think of them as representing. And it ensures that our model connects very tightly to the thing we're trying to explain, right? We're interested in the computer's mathematical abilities, so we describe it, understand it, start to finish through the mathematical structures that model it. Okay, so I should note that this is not just going to be the case with mathematical structures. Take an actual case of a computer that had to be reverse engineered, the Antikythera mechanism, which is a computer that was discovered off the coast of Antikythera, an ancient Greek computing device for calculating astronomical relationships, discovered last century. And it's been understood in the entire history of its investigation. It's been understood in terms of in representational terms as representing astronomical entities, representing the distance between the sun and the moon, or representing the speed of the sun relative to the speed of the moon, or something like that. And so here, it's not a mathematical domain. Mathematics is going to be involved, of course, but it's not a mathematical domain that we're thinking of it as representing. We're thinking of it as representing objects in the sky, right? Actual things, astronomical entities. And it's the relationship between those entities, it's the structure in astronomical, among astronomical objects that we're thinking of as the model of the device. So when we say when we say that the device represents the location of the sun, or the distance of the sun from the moon, we're saying that it is modeled by the actual relationship, the distance relationship between the sun and the moon. And likewise for its internal components too, gear trains being described in terms of their the specific, more fine-grained relationships between the sun and the moon. So you might say that the motion of the sun is being subtracted from the motion of the moon by some gear train. Again, thinking of these gears as representing the motion of the sun and representing the motion of the moon as a way of taking structures defined over those objects, the relationship in their motions, and imposing them on the mechanism as models of its causal structure. So what's going on in both these cases when we use representational notions is that we need models of relatively complex systems, and representational notions focus us on environmental structures that might provide models, whether the environment is astronomical entities or mathematical objects, and they help us connect the system to those models. So to actually bring this back to neuroscience, I want to talk about face recognition as an example. And I'm caught up to the face recognition literature to about the early 2000s. So it's going to be a very simplistic picture and a very sort of cartoon vision of even 2000s vision science, early 2000s vision science. But we think about the brain, or about the FFA in particular, as representing faces. And we think about earlier visual areas as representing lower level visual properties. Okay, and so the question is, again, not what is it to represent a face or a visual property, but why does thinking in these terms help us understand the brain? And again, the answer is that it gives us environmental structures to model the brain processes we're interested in, the ones that support the categorization of faces. So there is a structure in the environment. There's an imperfect function from low-level visual properties to the of an object, to the category that that object belongs to, whether it's a face or a non-face. And that gives us, just like in the mathematical case where the addition function gives us a model of the input-output structure of the circuit, this gives us a simple model of the input-output structure of the brain in this particular case, or in this particular task we're interested in. And then, of course, we describe the internal processes in representational terms too. And so this very this sort of cartoon version of the flowchart describing facial recognition at the top of the slide, we describe the intervening steps between input and output as representations of shapes and objects, and representations derived from them of the parts of a face, eyes, mouth, etc., bounding contours and their spatial relationships, and so on. So in this case, our models are derived not from, just like in the Antikythera mechanism, not from mathematical entities or relationships in a mathematical domain, but relationships between parts of the environment that we're interested in relating the brain to. And just like the relationship between low-level visual properties and faces, there is a relationship between a structural relationship between low-level visual properties and the shapes or objects in a scene, and a relationship between the shapes and objects in a scene and the facial, the parts of a face, or the spatial relationships between them in a scene, if they are in the scene, and then between the face parts in a scene and their spatial relationships and whether there is a face or not in the scene. And it's those structures that provide the finer grained model of the brain insofar as it does face recognition. So when we think of the brain as representing these finer grained features of the scene, between low-level properties and the category something belongs to as a face or not face, we're again using representational notions to pull structure from the environment, pull structures defined over environmental entities onto the brain as models of its causal structure. Okay, so that was quick, hopefully relatively clear. I'm just going to give a few upshots and then conclude. So first of all, I think we can understand representation in neuroscience entirely at the level of what using representational notions allows us to do, without asking at all what representation itself is. I think the notion of representation allows us to impose environmental structures onto the brain as models of its causal structure. And the picture is going to get more complicated as we look at more complicated visual processes and a more detailed understanding of them. But I think this is fundamentally what's going on when we talk about representation. This is extremely useful as long as the brain's causal structure actually does mirror environmental structures at a relatively fine grain. But representational thinking on this approach is just one sort of modeling resource. And in many cases, it's not going to be the most useful tool. And so to answer the original questions that I started with about what neural structures represent and so on, we really have to ask, when we ask those questions, we're really asking how we should go about modeling the neural structures. And so there are lots of implications here for debates over the relevance of behavior to neuroscience and debates over naturalistic stimuli and so on. But I will end there and thank you all for listening. And I'm very happy to answer questions, or my email's on the screen. So if you want to email comments or rebuttal or anything like that, I'd be happy to talk. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. That was great. Always welcome to have philosophers in the computational neuroscience world. We definitely need more input and more sources of input. Do you want to stop sharing screen? I don't know if I can do that without booting you off the stage.
Yes, sorry.
If I do. There we go. Perfect.
Okay. Thanks.
So in the interest of time, I think we're going to have to move on, but you can answer questions just by typing into the Ask a Question box. So it's kind of like a message board. So go ahead and do that. And once again, thank you, Andrew.